So, all right, so let's get started. Evening, everybody. Thanks for coming to our second to the last meeting. So there's still one more in July for those that can hopefully make it, but welcome. We have, of course, we have a presentation and a lot of discussion items to talk about. You received your packets. We've got a few things that we want to talk about tonight. We want to go over some of the key draft amendments. We want to discuss something that we're calling development capacity standards, or Florida area ratio, the FAR, that everyone loves to talk about. So we'll talk about that. We're going to talk about the code adoption process and next steps. And then we have time set aside for an open discussion as well. So if I may, I'm going to start the presentation. Of course, raise your hands, put questions in the chat, just like we always do, and we can have a dialogue as we go through the presentation. All right, so let me head over to that. I'm going to ask if folks can see it. Anyone? Are we seeing it? Great. Okay, so you had the great. Thank you. The agenda was part of your packets. So I don't need to linger on that. I'm just going to sit on this slide for just a second to go over kind of where we are in the project schedule so far. So we're at this point where we have circled in red. So this June 2021 or 2021. Yep, we're here at the draft code and map stage, and what and in the memo we talked about where we are right here is what we think of as a milestone. Certainly not an end product, but we're at a milestone in that we will have draft code and maps submitted to DLCD tomorrow to close out the grant that we received from DLCD. So we have what we're calling sort of a milestone or a foundation draft code and maps. We're going to go over some of those key items today. There will be an open house that will open at the end of next week, where we will again be sharing sort of the key amendments. We will have that draft code, including the draft tree code and maps available for folks to review, and then we'll get into the code adoption process from then on. And there's a bit more discussion that we will have about sort of what that code adoption process looks like at the end of the meeting tonight. So we'll go over kind of what that means. We have an adoption targeted sort of in winter. I'm thinking at Christmas that we will have a Christmas present, which is this new code and maps and so on. So I'm hoping for that. But again, we'll go over those details towards the end of the meeting. But we will be working on refinements to the code kind of from tomorrow on. And that's part of the reason why we asked if folks would be interested in having one more meeting in July to go over a couple of other things around cottage clusters and townhouse design standards. That's part of that refinement process as we move into the adoption process. So any questions kind of just about kind of where we are right this moment? And we will be talking a little bit more in detail about the code adoption process, the public engagement piece, kind of how folks can participate in that at the end. But is there anything I can answer for folks right now, or can get going? Okay. All right. So let's talk about the draft code amendments. And I'm going to move this over to, I think, Pauline. Pauline, are you taking over this part of it, or is it Marcy?
Yeah, I'm going to present.
Great, thanks.
So first of all, this is what the summary of proposed amendments table looked like in everybody's packet that you received. And so we wanted to take a bit of time in this meeting to walk you through some of the details. We wanted to also kind of put a capstone on the discussions that we've had. So the proposed amendments that we're putting forward really reflect and are a direct line from the comprehensive plan, also the vision and the goals and the policy. And so you can see that your summary of proposed amendments table is organized around the 3 policy mandates, which are also our 3 subject areas. So our proposed amendments are addressing aspects of those 3 topics of housing, trees, and parking. So that's how the amendments are organized. And you could go to the next slide, please, Vera. So again, to that point, we've heard really clearly from the CPIC how important and how much work has been done on the comprehensive plan, which is really obvious to us. And we wanted to respect that and hold ourselves accountable to that. So we've been tracking, as we create proposed amendments, which specific goals or policies of the comprehensive plan they are going to implement. And so they're right now, we're implementing aspects of chapters 3, 4, 6, 7, and 8, and those are related to our subject areas. And then we're also, through the amendments, addressing aspects of other important policy documents, such as the Urban Forestry Management Plan, the Housing Affordability Strategy, and the Climate Action Plan. So next slide, please. And I just want to pause for a minute and say that we are going to provide the more detailed code amendments, but this presentation is meant to be more the high level picture and to, again, kind of give an introduction so that when you get those detailed amendments, they're really clear and you understand that direct line from the comprehensive plan to each amendment. So the discussions that we've had, and we've really appreciated all the time, and really informative discussions. And so we've talked about a lot of different topics with the CPIC at this point in time. And so we wanted to put just sort of some active listening, put back some of the topics that we've gone through in order to remind the whole group how we came to the amendments that we're proposing. So first of all, I also want to explain that the amendments are this, how to move from the vision into the specifics. It's kind of the roadmap and how we're actually going to implement the policy. So the vision has goals, the comprehensive plan has goals and policies, but what we're putting forward in these amendments are specific changes to your maps and your land use code to implement that vision. So the starting point for our discussions with you has been, how is the city wanting to rethink its residential zones and really looking forward toward the future? What does it want its city to be? And particularly with regard to including more types of housing, more range of housing cost, to have attainable housing, and then being mindful of the impact that parking has on the costs and feasibility of housing, and also how important it is to preserve the existing amazing urban forest and grow the urban forest that is in Milwaukee today. And so looking at that relationship between trees and parking and increasing housing. So these are a lot of the topics that we've talked about, and now we wanted a chance to look at how are those actually translating into amendments. So next slide, please. So the first, we spent a lot of time, and I think we've all learned from this process really intimately about the zoning in Milwaukee. So I think if everybody walks away from this project, they all know what zone they live in and what that means. So this is the zoning map that we started out with, and we spent a lot of time talking about that. And if you look at the next slide, our revised map is going to have 3 residential zones. And this is based on the direct feedback we've received from the CPIC members. So we're going to have an R1, and we're maintaining the R1B based on those limited commercial zones that we want to keep. Sorry, limited commercial uses we want to keep. And then we're also going to have a R2 zone. So you can see what the map looks. And it really implements that vision of simplifying the residential zoning while also permitting a wide range of housing across the whole city. So it's a big sea shift. Next slide, please. And I should also mention, sorry, that those map changes will also be reflected in a revised comprehensive plan map with land use designations. Okay, so I'm going to walk through these again at a high level. Our amendments touched Title 16, which is where the tree code is, Title, and then Title 19. So our first draft of code is looking at some big ideas. So we looked at consolidating the residential zones like we went over, permitting new forms of middle housing, and that's duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, townhouse, and cottage clusters across those residential zones. And then looking at removing any limitations or barriers to middle housing. So for example, one of our amendments was there was an existing code language that limited the number of dwellings to 1 per lot. So we struck that through. There's another standard that limited housing on lots to 3,000 square feet. We struck that through so that even if we were to permit new middle housing, there's no existing standards that would make that middle housing unfeasible. We've also amended the code to treat manufactured homes and ADUs and duplexes the same as single dwellings in certain ways. So they're allowed outright without additional review, or the ADUs will still have additional additional design standards, but they're clear and objective, just like the design standards for single detached dwellings and all the new middle housing types. So we're really going to be treating all residential types on an equal footing, which is really the intent and the vision of House Bill 2001, but also the comprehensive plan vision. And then around parking, we've had some great discussions and some really clear direction from the CPIC, which is not always the case. So that's been a really great aspect of this project. So we have proposed a handful of amendments around parking, and we've removed the restriction on providing parking in the front and side setback. And then we've reduced the number of parking spaces on site to 1 per home. And we're also permitting middle housing to use through a modification process some portion of the on-street parking supply. And so if they can show through certain measurements that that would work, they're allowed to do that. So that reduces the barrier of providing all that parking on the site itself. So that's a big overview. I covered a lot. I'm going to pause and see if people have questions, and then we're also going to take a poll before we move on to talking a little bit more about the tree code.
I see Councillor Beatty has her hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify on the design standards piece for ADUs, manufactured duplexes. I had just assumed duplexes already just had to comply with our regular residential design standards for single family home. But is that the idea that we'll keep more or less the standards we have and just apply them uniformly across types?
Yeah, absolutely. There were some minor small parts that were different for duplexes kind of sprinkled throughout the code, but that's definitely the approach.
Okay.
If I could jump in just quickly, Councillor Beatty, the part of the duplex code piece also there's a second section for duplexes that required land use review depending on what location, what zone it was in, and if it was on a corner. So there were these other things about duplexes that we needed to take out to be consistent, both certainly with our comprehensive plan, but also with the House bill as well. So some of those kinds of things, but the design standards generally are staying the same. But it was some of those the land use review aspect of it. For ADUs, it was the same thing, just trying to kind of streamline and clarify that piece of the process. Yeah.
Renee, you have a question?
I think somebody was before me.
Oh, were they? Okay. Stephen, sorry, did you have your hand up first?
Yeah, it's Stefan.
Sorry.
Not a question, but just a suggestion, and that would be that you not label the new residential zones R1 and R2, because I think that's just going to lead to long-term confusion. So I'd suggest RM and RH or something like that.
Yeah, we had a lot of discussions about what to name them. So thank you for that suggestion.
Stefan, if you come up with anything magical, you let us know, because we have been struggling with that, realizing that 1 and 2 is not good. So if anybody has any big ideas, let us know.
Renee?
Well, I have a question about the residential zones. I think if I just understood, you said there were 3 and then you said there were 2, and I thought there were 2. So, yeah. And that's an example of my next question / comment is that when you're saying we decided this and we decided that, who is we? Because throughout this whole process, we talk about some stuff. We have these one-off polls. We've talked a little bit about what our role is as CPIC and what the decision-making process is, but I don't feel like we as CPIC. And when we come to these meetings and there's these, we talked about something last time, I don't feel like there's any decision, and then suddenly we have decided it. So I'm asking you who we is.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very fair question. I'm going to tackle the first part of that question, which is that we had looked at two proposed zones, which was a moderate and a high density residential. And I believe it was Joseph or maybe Daniel brought up the limited commercial uses that are permitted in R1B. And so as we looked further into that, we realized that we wanted to continue to permit those uses. So it's 3 zones, which is now to be renamed RH, RM, and I guess RHB. And so it's 3 zones. And that's, if you want to show the map again, Vera, to be really clear about that and where those locations are. Yeah. And while you're talking about that, while we're showing that, I'm happy to address the second part of your question. And if Marcy or Vera, Laura, or Mary, anyone wants to jump in to add more. But I would say our approach has been to present issues and bigger topics to the CPIC, hear the feedback, try to clarify that feedback through the polls we've been using, and then take that direction and apply it to proposed amendments. I also want to point out that these are all draft amendments, and this is our first kind of line in the sand, our first stab at trying to articulate what we've heard both from the CPIC members and from our open house responses, and trying to find a balanced approach that's going to implement the overall vision of the comprehensive plan. So it is a draft, and we'll continue to work through those and refine, and there's a lot of issues in there. And we always think if we didn't make everyone happy, then we must have done it correctly, because we're trying to balance all those different opinions that have been presented to us.
Yeah, I think you've articulated that really well. Thanks, Pauline. If I can just kind of go back to the zones just really quickly. So when our current high density zones allow some commercial uses, what was kind of a sticking point was that the R1B in particular allows some commercial uses by right, and none of the other high density zones do. So in trying to figure out how to maintain that, we couldn't consolidate all of the high density zones into one, because we wanted to make sure that we were still kind of honoring the R1B, which is sort of this transition zone between the downtown and the other and then sort of how the other residential uses or the high density residential uses kind of go around. It's just located here in the downtown, but in order to maintain that and keep that consistent, the R1B as it currently stands would remain its own zone. So and this sort of all happened within the last couple of days, to be honest. So if this slide still says 2 residential zones, I didn't catch that when we were making the edits. So so we've been talking about 2 residential zones with CPIC this whole time as a consolidation, but when we really got into the weeds of what that consolidation would mean, what has remained is that we actually need 3 so that we can maintain the limited commercial uses that are permitted outright in the R1B, because in the other ones they are allowed as a conditional use, and so they're consistent together, they can be consolidated, but that's why the R1B is here. So that's the result. That's where we landed with the 3. But I don't know that sorry, go ahead.
The R1B, it looks, I mean, this map is really tiny, but it looks like it's that big chunk of it in historic Milwaukee and a little bit of it at the south end of downtown. Is that
it's right on Lake Road at 21st. Yep.
Ah, okay.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. And I think, to me, or at least the way, Pauline articulated kind of how we get to where we get, is exactly right. The CPIC has been as well as our open houses and all of our conversations with, with the public through the surveys and all of this stuff, but, predominantly through the CPIC, we've been getting direction from CPIC on how to, on these big issues or these big questions, and then we need to translate that into code. So that's how we've landed here. So the we is our interpretation of kind of what we've heard, we staff and consultants have heard from CPIC for this collective in order to translate that into code. And again, draft code. And that's sort of where we are right now. With draft code that we can now be working on, but we needed to get to code at some point, and here we are, based on the direction of all of the conversations and all of the meetings and everything that we've had with CPIC and through our open houses to date.
And to tag on to that, I think the reason we wanted to have a poll after this overview is to make sure, are there some big issues that we have discussed that are important that have come up at CPIC that we're not seeing here, or if we feel like the amendments that are being put forward accurately represent the discussions we've had here.
Okay. All right. Are we ready for the poll? Is that sort of where we are?
I think so, yeah.
Now? Okay. So just generally based on the on sort of what Pauline has been talking about, or what we've been talking about sort of so far, what we want to understand from you folks is, you know, has what we've just talked about is sort of this overview of what these draft code amendments will have. Are we adequately following the direction from the CPIC discussions? And you've got multiple options in the poll, but that's kind of just what we want to understand. Are we generally following the direction from CPIC accurately or adequately, I guess is the word that we're using. But, and if there are other things that we need to talk about, we can do that. All right. That's everyone, but we've got some, while that's happening in the chat. Okay. All right. So I've got 9. I think that's everybody. So generally, we're in the right direction. And certainly folks, and some folks need to see the code language first. Totally understand that, being the code person as well. So absolutely, and yes, and you will all be getting that as well. And then we will really dive into the details. But this is helpful. Thanks. And Renee, yes, we haven't really discussed the tree piece of it, and we're going to go over some of that in a minute. And then we can move forward with that as well. But nope, good point. Thank you. Okay, let me out of that. All right. Coming back to
Renee was stating something, but you were muted, Renee.
Oh, sorry.
I don't think my vote got in there. It's just saying, because it says 0% said that there was something we haven't talked about or whatever it was, the third one down. And that's what I voted for.
Okay, and by that you meant the tree code piece? I know you put that in the chat, so I'm just wondering if that's what you meant. Sorry, you're muted still. Sorry.
Sorry, that's
No
that's the big one.
Yeah.
I generally I don't think we've discussed a lot of the things that have been decided on. I think they were brought up. There was maybe some discussion, and then the next meeting they're presented as decisions. That's my feeling. For example, the 3,000 square foot minimum lot. We talked about it. I can't remember if we had a poll or not, but suddenly it's been presented as if it's a given. I think that's that may reflect a lot of input from elsewhere, but I don't feel like we got as CPIC. I don't feel like we had a lot of discussion about it.
I would tend to agree with that. I did hear from Vera at the city council meeting that actually came more from planning commission discussions, I think. So, I mean, that's an interesting anomaly in the discussion of how the we is arrived at. I mean, that seems to me to have been driven by the planning commission discussion more than our discussion.
If I may, with all due respect, it didn't come only from planning commission. We talked about that at city council and planning commission and at CPIC, and the general direction seemed to be that we could at least propose that as a draft and see where we land through the adoption process. So I just kind of wanted to put that out there. So as far as a decision, we need direction on on where to go. So I think that it's in the draft right now, and we can see where it lands through the code adoption process on that particular point. Anyway,
I can't remember. I mean, you did take a poll on that one, I believe. Can't remember exactly how it came out, but I know there were quite a number of still feeling like it needed more fleshing out and more discussion.
Yep. And it will. There's 6 months of that still to come for sure. Okay. Shall we proceed? All right, let's go here.
Great. So we wanted to give an overview also of the tree code. And we had some discussion with this with our consultant Todd Prager at our last meeting, but I also wanted to let the committee know that there's been a lot of ongoing discussions with the tree board, and they've been very involved in defining this code, both upfront, what are the big issues, all the way through detailed line by line edits. So they've really been involved. The tree code is doing a bunch of different things. And so I want to walk through those one by one. So first of all, it's establishing priority trees to preserve. And there's several different types that are identified. And there's an emphasis first and foremost on native and climate resilient species. And so that's in response to the urban forestry management plan and the comprehensive plan. And then there's clear and objective standards for how to preserve and protect those priority trees. And there's also mitigation requirements spelled out if those preservation standards are not met. So we talked about what are we preserving and then how are we actually going to preserve it. It's important to note that these standards are going to apply to all residentially zoned land. And so the way they go into effect is through any land division or construction of new units. And the code is also defining the process of then how would an applicant go about putting in their application for development, and how the city reviews that application. And so we go into what is included in a tree preservation plan or also a tree canopy plan. And so what does an applicant put in so that the city can adequately review their proposal? And then I think there's 3 other important aspects I want to point out. So there is this issue of establishing a minimum tree canopy. So looking both at preserving individual priority trees on a site, but how to manage and grow the tree canopy citywide, while also paying attention to doing that equitably across the city and starting to grow other areas that may be lacking in that tree canopy now. And so the code establishes a minimum tree canopy of 40% through lot, and that's both through preserving existing trees and adding new trees. And that's trying to get again at that cumulative effect. So the code is also establishing a tree fund that's going to use both the permit fees and any fees in lieu. So if somebody chooses to take out a tree, they have to pay a fine. So we're trying to prevent that through fining. So then any of those funds can be used to maintain the urban forest citywide and address other goals around trees. And then finally, I want to point out that the code also creates a non-development tree removal and replacement process. And we went over that. Todd mentioned that as an important tool to try to prevent pre or post-development tree removal. So that's an overview, and I'm going to pause for more detailed questions. I see that Micah, you have your hand up. I don't know if others, so maybe we'll start with Micah.
Yeah, 2 things that you said at the beginning and one at the end to me contradict each other. You mentioned that the tree code is overlaid over the entire city, but is only implemented in land division or development situations. Said that early on. And then at the end, you said that there's an additional piece that touches on non-development and residential tree removal. And the latter is what I've been observing the tree board conversations, and the latter is where I've heard the conversation going. But how do those two things work together?
That's a really great question. I appreciate the level of detail. I'm going to turn that over to Natalie because I know that she's been at all those tree board meetings and working closely on that.
Yeah, so the tree code that's being proposed right now does have kind of two components to it. The first one is in that development, and there's different restrictions that are being applied, such as taking a look at the total canopy coverage of the site, as well as the number of trees on the site. So, for example, if a site was going to be developed, the developer needs to, or has a limit, I believe they can only remove 33, as it's written right now, only remove 33% of the total canopy cover, but they still have to do a replanting as well. And that's different than if it was an individual property owner removing one tree. So that's why it's kind of written in two chunks, because we kind of have the independent property owner who might be doing a one-time tree removal and wanting to submit it through that process, versus a larger development process where they might need to be taking a site-wide approach to it. And we want maybe a larger, more development review process in it.
And one follow-up question, what would deter a developer for going the second route, pre-development, where the restrictions might be lesser, and then coming with a development?
Yeah, we've talked about that. So for other folks to understand, it's essentially why wouldn't a developer talk to a private property owner and have them remove all of the trees before the site is developed? Well, I think that's why it's really important for us to have this review process that our urban forester will be involved with. There's going to be the restrictions are going to be pretty significant for removing a large amount of trees. I believe I'm not looking at the code right now, but we've thrown out different DBH for one thing requirements, but then the nice part about it is that we will have the urban forester reviewing that application, and we can always deny it. And so City of Portland, I believe City of Lake Oswego, they essentially allow in their code for folks to take out a certain number of trees kind of per year, and that's just allowed ahead of time. And we don't have that in this draft code proposal. Essentially, every tree would need to go through the permitting process. So there's that opportunity to deny the permit.
Thanks.
Vera, I'm not sure what order people's hands went up. Or
I'm not sure
somebody else.
either. Renee and
Dom-
Dominique, but
I think
yeah.
Dominique was next, then Renee.
Thanks. I just had, in saying this to someone who doesn't know a lot about tree code, so forgive me if it's a silly question, but would the fund allow for property individuals to access, grants or something for safety maintenance? And I'll say that as someone who's coming from, so I have 6 giant Doug firs on my property. During the ice storm, we became very much aware that some of them were hanging over the power lines and took them out. That's a very expensive endeavor. And so I'm just wondering, would that be a use for it? And if not, what are the uses we envisioned that fund for?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I can't speak to what the tree fund will be exactly used to yet. I think we need to explore that with our tree board and our council. Ideas that have come up include coordinated plantings. A lot of it will just go back into replantings, probably on public or right of ways. But we have talked about kind of combining, potentially seeking this as another opportunity to fund some more equity focused tree planting and provisions. I will say that the tree code does have exceptions and exemptions in it that allow for significant safety hazards, significant impacts to infrastructure, which can't be mediated practicably. So if there was a tree overhanging a power line and it was a safety hazard as determined by an arborist, there wouldn't be a fine associated or a permit be associated to it. And
if I could have a follow-up, sorry, I didn't realize I was on mute. we don't have anything in place. So for then a property owner like us who doesn't want to remove the tree but wants to remove the limbs that are creating the hazard, that's just the property owner is always going to bear that. So in theory, I mean, if we're trying to encourage keeping the older trees, right, I can get cleared, I can get an exemption by saying it's a hazard and get it removed. But if somebody wanted to keep the tree, they're going to have to fund that out of their own pocket. It just seems counterintuitive. I'm putting that out there.
No, definitely. And, you know, it's definitely a barrier, particularly for folks thinking about street trees in their neighborhood and concerns about taking care of them. And I think it's something, you know, our urban forest program's only a couple of years old now, and it's definitely something that we want to think about in the future. But for now, we just don't have the funds to have some sort of incentive or support program like that. But it's a great idea.
Okay. Renee.
My comment actually was in the same vein. I brought it up before that I think there should be a component of the tree code that addresses maintenance, because there's a lot of emphasis on the new planting and such, but what that doesn't allow for is that trees take a long time to mature, and there's a lot in between the original planting and making sure it's healthy and where you have large trees like Dominique is referring to. And, you know, yes, if you buy a home on a piece of property that has trees, you're taking on that responsibility. But at the same time, if it's contributing to the overall good of the tree canopy and the health that comes with that in various forms, it seems to me that is a vital component, is to encourage and facilitate people being able to safely maintain and the trees and allow them to prosper. Because if you don't maintain trees, you're more likely to lose them, and or have people decide, well, it's a safety concern, so I'm not going to maintain it, I'm going to cut it down, which I think we saw a lot of in the recent past, and whether it was citywide, like I don't know if it was Oregon City or whatever that had all the hoo-ha about cutting down too many trees, or just individuals. I've seen a lot of trees that have just completely been taken down instead of trying to be rehabilitated, because it's expensive. So I second that.
Yeah, and I would agree with you that there's a cost associated with caring for them. Unfortunately, we can't always calculate the equivalent cost coming out, or cost benefit that we're getting out from a tree in stormwater utilities, in air quality and public health and aesthetics and property increase. Actually is what we're seeing in terms of property value. You know, and I think it all comes down to, I think we would love to offer some sort of assistance program, but where do the funds come from unless the community also chooses to potentially help pay for it in aggregate? And so I think right now we're exploring just ensuring that folks are protecting the trees that are on their property. And then as our urban forest and education program grows, we can seek out partnerships to help with that maintenance, particularly for our low income community.
I get that, but it seems like if we're doing if we're developing for the first time, I think in Milwaukee, a tree code, and there's absolutely nothing in there provisions for future whatever. I mean, it's not even the maintenance piece or the collective good. I haven't even seen it mentioned, and it just seems like it needs to be, something needs to be in there that allows it to then be developed, even if it's not in its final rendition.
You're saying include in the code talking about an incentive program in the future, or a assistance program? I'm just trying to better understand what you're proposing for so I can bring it back to tree board.
Yeah, I mean, if somebody's gonna, let's say you have somebody who's new to Milwaukee, they're gonna say, oh, I wonder how Milwaukee deals with trees and canopies. And then they look at the code and there's not a single thing in there about it. Not even the idea that it's a value or that it's potential future goal or anything, then there's nothing to build on. And if every couple years you're going to review it, great. Then in a couple years from now, when there's maybe a more understanding of how much money is in the tree fund and what you want to do with it, then you can put it in. But is the tree code going to be reviewed every X number of years? A small amount of years.
Well, and I think that would be a question for our planning staff. I mean, we do have, a lot of what we have for prospective programs and projects like this fall within our policy documents and our climate action plan and our urban forest management plan, which are updated frequently and essentially, from what my understanding, kind of express to the community our values and where this is coming from. While code maybe is a little bit more objective and doesn't have more of the what we want to do, it's the what we're doing right now, black and white. And so I totally agree with you. I think that there is a lot of opportunity in offering assistance. We've been talking about, even at the Library of Things, having tree care packages that folks can check out. It's just right now, as we're working on this code, I think we're taking the first bite of a very delicious sandwich to come.
If I could, just from as planning staff, since Natalie mentioned planning staff, as far as I think all of these things are absolutely possible. They sound more programmatic to me than code. And so the code will establish kind of the rules and the regulations and so on. The programs that can help, like what you're suggesting, Renee, and Dominique, sort of this idea of having a maintenance, a program to help homeowners maintain the trees on their property, or those are program things that can be seeded through funds somehow, from mitigation funds or from the funds that are brought in from the tree code or something. Maybe there are funds that city council chooses to use to seed a program like that. And not to put you on the spot, Councilor Beatty, I'm just suggesting that there's ways to create a program that are outside the code. So the language in the code wouldn't necessarily need to say anything about a program like that, because code doesn't get rewritten or reviewed necessarily that often. The program can kind of float outside of the code and help to implement some of those things. And we've heard that. This is not the first time we've heard that. There were several comments within the open house chat, sort of those discussions where folks were concerned about obviously loving trees and wanting to take care of them, but understanding the expense that's associated with that. And is there going to be kind of a parallel program that will help folks pay for that? And so I think that's something that the department, certainly, through Peter and Natalie's folks, can put something like that together and see kind of how that would work with the tree board's help or something, and kind of run that alongside the code. Very valid questions and concerns, for sure.
Micah, I saw your hand up, and then
I think I just left it up. Sorry.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
Eugene and Dan both have questions, I think. I don't know who went first, though. So, Eugene, I'm going to pick Eugene.
Yeah, I think it was Eugene first.
Eugene, go ahead.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. Hey, the questions and thoughts I had were kind of pre-stated by Vera, when she talked about programming and education. And while Natalie was talking about money that could be distributed in some way to assist people or solve a problem, I'm thinking initially it was the topic was, in pertaining to trees, was climate resistant trees. And so if somebody could give me just a quick down and dirty definition of what that is, I would appreciate it. And also, if in 2 years, after things have kind of coalesced, come together, I'm hoping there would be an information bank where people, local residents, could talk to somebody in the city about trees that do not use a lot of water and trees that are less prone to burn up if there's a fire? Because I'm sure research has been done on both of those particulars. Thank you.
I love that question, Eugene. You kind of answered your own question. What is a climate resilient tree species? So a climate resilient tree species is one that takes into consideration the future climate to come. So right now we love our Doug firs here in Oregon. I think they're a jewel and a gem, and we all have them on our license plate. But as our summers get hotter and as we're seeing 90, 100-degree weather, they don't do as well because they're not used to this hot of weather and dry temperature. And so when we talk about climate resilient trees, we're talking about tree species that maybe don't grow here now, but might grow really well here in the future. So, we're planting a lot of cedars and dawn redwoods and trees like that, which kind of fill that same niche maybe as some other of our local native species, and they're not invasive, so they won't go and run amok, but they grow really well here in a new and changing climate. And they're oftentimes drought tolerant, and they're oftentimes fire resistant, or at least they have fire in part of their regime in terms of how they kind of reproduce and spread. So that's exactly what a climate resilient tree species is. And talking about information banks, that's something that we've been talking about. And I agree with you 100%. I encourage everyone to go on our city website. On our sustainability department, we have an urban forest homepage, and there's a bunch of web pages there with some resources. Later this year, we're going to be working with some contractors to develop more outreach and education materials so that we can have it all there. And with our new, we're hiring a new urban forester. And one thing that we're going to be really working with them on is outreach for our urban forest program. And so I think I am 100% with you. And I wish that we had a lot more materials right now to share with other folks. But I would encourage everyone to go on those urban forest pages for now and take a look. And then also, if you're looking for climate adapted tree species right now, or drought tolerant plants and tree species, the Portland plant list is kind of the golden standard for our area. And it's like 100 pages of beautiful plants you can flip through. So, and I think that's also on our pages as well.
Okay, and I think we have time for one more question, and then we're gonna head over to the next phase of things. So Dan, go ahead.
So I actually have a comment, not a question. I hope that's all right.
Of course, yeah.
It's a two-parter. One is I had a similar line of questions in my mind that Micah was posing. And for my part, at least, I feel like I actually need to see the code to get a better sense of the relationship between the pre and post development removal process and the protections that would apply at the time of development or land division. I do think that if not done well, there's the real risk of people trying to game the system in a way that's unintended. And I will also just sort of add my voice to urging the city staff in development of a tree fund program and how that money is used to really consider the ROI on different sorts of expenditures, whether it be new plantings or perhaps maintenance or work done on mature trees or heritage trees. I can tell you anecdotally, we have a street tree. It is what would probably be considered a heritage native Oregon white oak that was severely damaged in the ice storm. And we had multiple arborists tell us that it's a long-term hazard. Actually, every arborist told us it's a long-term hazard. Most of them said, you should just take it out. We've had one arborist that said, I think I can try to salvage the tree by doing major retrenchment pruning that will require regular maintenance moving forward. And in all the cases, you're talking like high 4 figures to 5 figures up front for the work. And then regular maintenance is low 4 figures every few years after that. And I think it's very rational for a property owner to essentially be looking at the costs and making a determination based on the cost. And for the city, the question is there a policy interest in trying to shift that calculation one way or another for certain types of scenarios?
Yeah, I think that's a very valid point. And I know I have Peter Passarelli, our public works director in my backyard, reminding me that You know, we did go from spending on our urban forest program from about $3 per capita to upwards of $10, $11, $12 per capita in the last 3 years. So I wouldn't, and I think that's reflective of our council supporting urban forest programming. And I'm hoping that that trend can continue and we can develop more of these assistance programs as we kind of bake it into our city processes.
Can I ask a follow-up really quick? Sorry. Is the tree fund money already have a designation? Is that already somewhere where we can look it up, or is that still being developed?
Nope, we don't have any designation for it. The tree fund really only came to fruition with our public tree code adoption, and it's only a few months essentially old, so there's no designation to it.
So will that be, that committee will be deciding where that fund goes, or will that go to the city council?
My guess would be it would be a proposal from tree board for some ideas, and it likely would go to city council for advice and guidance and adoption or resolution.
Thank you.
All right. I think we're ready to move to the next section. FAR and development capacity. Is everybody ready for some math? Okay. Sorry, maybe I'm the only one, but all right. Let's move on over here to development
Can
capacity.
people hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Because I'm going to walk you through this part of the presentation. You can just move straight to the next slide. We've tried to make the math pictorial, so that's easier to kind of take in. I want to talk about the size of development on residential lots, because that's come up, you know, obviously it's on everybody's mind. There's a lot of development capacity that has that's in your code. And now that we see more middle housing options coming in the future, there have been a lot of concerns and questions about, will that, how big will things be and how will they kind of look next to my house? So I want to walk you through the way that the code works. Starting with the most basic things, existing zoning tools are set up to limit the size of a house, to create separation between the house and the neighboring house. They do that through setbacks, which is the space between where you can build and your property line. Thank you. And the maximum height is also set. It's a very standard, every city has that. And it says that how tall a building can be. And then the lot size is also set, which has a effect on all those other forms. And on the right, you can see a kind of hypothetical existing site, kind of like we've done some trade-off discussions on. And you're likely to have a house sitting within the setback that doesn't take full advantage of the lot, the full lot area that you could build on. You probably have some trees, and you probably do also have parking typically on that lot. So next, Vera. Now I want to add in a couple of little additional things that the city of Milwaukee does. These are somewhat unique. Not very many cities have these additional standards. They're intended to sculpt that shape. So it's not just a big box, but it actually kind of moves away from adjacent property at an upper level. And also that you can't cover the full area of the lot inside of the setbacks. You actually are limited through a maximum percentage. So those are two additional tools that the city of Milwaukee applies: the maximum lot coverage and the side yard height plane. And the photo on the upper right is intended to show you what happens when you don't have an upper, a side yard height plane. You could have a gable end roof, as in that example, that runs fully side to side. And people, you know, in Milwaukee some time ago decided that that was not appropriate in this particular city. When you add all those tools together, the ones that I talked about in the previous slide and these, you get a shape that we've been referring to as the Jello mold. And when you place the floors that you could build into that, the maximum height in Milwaukee is 2.5 stories, 35 feet or 2.5 stories. Then you can actually calculate how much square footage can be built inside that Jello mold. So if we could move to the next slide. A lot of people have asked, what is that maximum development capacity? And so we've calculated it out for you. For a typical 5,000 square foot lot, 7,000 and a 10,000 square foot lot. And I've made the numbers kind of bold there for you below. And as most people will think, well, 4,375 sounds like a lot. And it is. It's more than a typical dwelling you might see in most of Milwaukee. In a lot of other cities and other states, or even here in the metro area, Portland, for example, it has recently started to see homes, a single dwelling that would take close to full advantage of that. But it is pretty much not seen in smaller cities, and Milwaukee is similar. And then in addition to putting those numbers there for you, I've also figured that just as a rough number of dwelling units at 1,000 square feet, how many of those you could fit in that Jello mold. So on the 5,000 square foot lot, where we have upwards of 4,000 square feet available, you could potentially have 4 dwellings. They still have to fit into that shape. And then on the 7,000 at upwards of 5,000 development capacity, you could have 5 dwellings, and on the 10,000 square foot lot, you could have 7. Now, obviously, the 10,000 square foot lots get a lot bigger as well. In Milwaukee, we have some really, really large lots, upward of 10,000 square feet. So if we could go to the next slide, please.
If I could jump in, Marcy, sorry, I saw that I think there are 3 people that have their hands up or have questions. Sorry, I can't exactly tell when I see my screen. So I just didn't know, is this a good place to answer those questions, or do you want to wait to the end?
We have via their chat comments.
Their chats, sorry, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, I'd be happy
and-
to,
Yeah.
that one question of, I'm still hoping for a solid definition of a half story. If we could go back to the diagram that shows that one there, that's, you can see the white dotted line around the edge is representing a floor level. And the second, so that's the first floor is the ground. The second floor is that level. And then on top of there, you can build about a half of that volume. That's why it's called a half story. Does that answer your question, Stefan?
I would like to see it defined in the code, because I've actually been through a code argument about this in another city a long time ago, and we didn't have a good definition.
Yeah, it would probably be something like a story that is habitable as a height of 6 feet or 6 feet 8 inches or 8 feet, something like that. And when you have a diagonal plane, that's going to mean that that's what that side yard height plane forces you to have a diagonal shape. Then that pushes you in 8 feet or 6 foot 8 inches. So yeah, we'd like to have a definition. We can probably accommodate that.
We may actually already have
we do.
one.
Our code has a definition for half story, and it has a lot of the components, Marcy, that you just talked about. I'm happy to read it out to everybody if you want to hear it, but it has exactly kind of what you're suggesting. Kind of it minimizes the amount of space, vertical space you can have in the half story. But
I'll try and find it and then add it in
put it in the chat.
box.
That'd be great.
Yeah, perfect.
Thank you.
So what's the lot coverage maximum in these calculations? In the R5, it's 30 5%,
Mhm.
but that goes down in the R10. Actually, I think it goes down in, I'm sorry, we're not using these R5s, 7s, and 10s anymore. For a 7,000 and a 10,000 square foot lot, it's 30%. Is that correct, Vera?
That is correct. Yes,
Okay.
under the current code. Correct. Yeah.
Any other questions before we move on? I can't see people's hands, so if you could just, if
I don't
someone
see
else
any,
could watch out.
Marcy.
Great. Okay. So next I want to talk about, so we've talked about the size of the volume, the number of floors, and the amount of square footage that you can build inside the jello mold. Obviously, people have asked, for obvious reasons, people have asked, well, what's that? What is the difference between that and a typical house? So we finally put the little white models that are based on actual homes, typical homes. You'll remember that we kind of drew 5 different house types that we thought represented the spectrum of house types that you might find in, at least house shapes that you might find in Milwaukee. And they varied from the pre-war bungalow or Victorian that you might see close to downtown to the more single level ranch type house in the outer northeast area that often has a garage built into that under, in the roof shape includes a garage space. So these tend to be, as you can see, 1,960 or 1,500 square feet. So generally, the typical home, I think you could say, is somewhere between 1,000 to 2,000 square feet. Obviously, there are going to be ones that are bigger and smaller than that, but that's, I think, the range that we're talking about. And when we put the little white house into the jello mold, you can kind of see the difference. You can also numerically see the difference. We have some photos on the next, and that just, thanks, Mary, just put the definition for a half story into the chat. And then we looked at some actual new homes, and I want to go through each of these because they're interesting. We have the numbers here. On the upper photo, I believe this is 2 new constructions. So it's a lot of the smaller homes are pre-existing as of like maybe 1950s or 60s or 70s homes. But these 2 are new and they're quite different in size, just to give you an idea of what's being built today. So the one on the right is a single dwelling, 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths on a 5,000 square foot lot, slightly more. And the house itself is about 2,600 square feet. It's still not reaching that maximum capacity, but it's much larger than the one next door, which is on also a 5,000 square foot lot and is closer to 1,700 square feet, 3 bedrooms, 2 baths. It's quite low scaled for that amount of living space, actually. On the bottom photo, then we have an older home to the left. And then the one on the right is a duplex. That's actually 1,600 square feet on a 6,000 square foot lot. Right, so now I would like to talk about a couple of ways that we could understand this volume and potentially control it to a greater extent than it might be today. And that would be like setting a maximum development capacity. So I want to make sure that people understand these 2 terms because they're different from each other. Development capacity is the maximum amount of floor area or square footage of home or homes that could be built on a property. And then a floor area ratio, which is thrown around a lot as a term, is an actual kind of a developer term. And it means the amount of floor area that as a ratio to the amount of site area. So if you have, it's expressed as a ratio. And if your zoning says you have a 2-to-1 FAR, that means you get 2 square feet of floor area to build for every 1 square foot of site area. And I bring these two terms up because we may come back to them later. Next.
Can we pause here really quickly? I have a question from Counselor Beatty in the chat that's asking if the calculations for this one, this here includes garages.
Yes, they do.
Oh, and then we have a hand raised from Renee.
Just a clarification on the last slide. Is that the floor area ratio, is that either or with the 35% or 30%, or is it and? Because it doesn't
And
seem
it's
like
and.
Okay, so it's
Well, and this isn't being
secondary?
proposed. This number is not being proposed. It's just it's just an example of how the term is used.
Okay, but so in general, are we looking at that as a different option than we've already seen as the existing code, or a secondary consideration?
It's a secondary consideration. I'm glad you asked that question, because when we come to talking about ways to potentially control the maximum development capacity, you could do it through square footage, which would be to reduce the maximum development capacity, or you could use the tool of FAR to do it. Those are two different ways to do that. And we're not making a proposal about which way is better at this point. But actually, I do want to go back to something that you brought up, Renee, through your question. You said the floor area ratio, is that instead of or along with, say, lot coverage? Its floor area ratio is still controlled by setbacks and height and other sculpting forms. And it's not uncommon in some situations that a lot can be granted far more floor area ratio than can fit into the Jello mold. So we were joking at my office about, should we be calling this the pancake batter or the Jello mix that you put into the Jello mold? You can get more FAR through your zone than you can use. I mean, that's actually rather common. So floor area ratio is a separate thing from all of the standards that shape the building. And it's probably pretty abstract, but I'm hoping later we'll be able to talk about this more. So if we could talk about the next slide, this is an example of how development capacity would be calculated. It would simply be, here's your Jello mold, and it limits the amount of floors that you can build and the number of square feet that you can build. That's one way we could control the maximum capacity. Next. Here's a picture of how floor area ratio works. You're given a floor area ratio. We would still, if that were true, we would still keep in place all these other standards, and that floor area ratio would be allowed to fill up the volume. But the benefit of having a floor area ratio is that you can set a height. You can also limit it. You can use it to set a maximum development capacity. Okay, so we're going to go, we're going to ask you a question. I actually meant to prep you a little earlier. Given what you've seen, do people think the development capacity should be decreased from what it is today? That's one question. And another question is actually, if you feel that development capacity should be reduced, say for one dwelling, how do people feel about using that as a kind of give back to gain more middle housing, so or other things? It's a city of Portland, for example, has established an FAR, and they limited it from what it was before, but for every additional dwelling, you get a little bit of FAR back. So they're using it as an incentive to meet some of their affordable housing and housing goals. And it could be similarly used here. I just want to make the point that with this sea change that's going on in residential zones, there's an opportunity for the city to take control over that development capacity and potentially use it for a positive effect. Otherwise, it just becomes a part of the zone, the law, and you don't get anything for it. I see Councilor Beatty has a question.
I do. I was curious as to, we've talked a lot in the last couple of meetings about allowing for multiple buildings as opposed to one single building. So would you just carve up that Jello mold into 4 pieces and scatter it around the property? I mean, is that how that would work? Or would that calculation be affected by the fact that they're building it as 4 separate buildings?
The Jello mold does just get parsed out into separate pieces. You still would be subject to that maximum coverage, but it might be in 3 or 4 different patches, and you'd still be subject to that maximum square footage, but it might be in 3 or 4 different volumes.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? Oh, yes, Jennifer.
And that applies to ADUs as well, any form of dwelling, just cumulative?
Yes. The maximum coverage requirement applies to anything that covers the site. In the code, it actually refers to a pole barn. So, I mean, it could be something that you can see through, but if it's still covering the site, it counts toward your 35 or 30% maximum lot coverage.
Yeah, so like sheds or any other building on the site will count towards that maximum lot coverage. So it's not just the house. Yeah.
But not pavement.
Correct, not pavement.
But I want to point out that if you have a garage space inside under the cover of your home, say, or in a garage, that would count. But if it were a parking space on a paved area, that would not count.
Yeah, it kind of is. Does it have a roof? And if it does, and it counts, yeah.
All right, then maybe we're ready for the poll.
Do we want to go show the slide again of what the maximum capacity would be with the current standards? I think that might be helpful.
The one with the 3 figures on it, the 3 numbers?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. I think it's the one, yeah, that one.
Okay, so I just pulled up the lot coverage question, kind of about that, how people feel about kind of the numbers that you see here on the slide. Should maximum lot coverage be increased above 35%? And these would be for middle housing. Below 35% stay, or what further information do you need? And then obviously put that in the chat and we can try and help answer those questions. Or if you have questions now, you can ask them too.
I have a question now, actually, that it would help me answer this better. So I'm not a developer, but if I think about if I was, why would I want to build a cottage cluster, which takes up a lot of surface area and only I should say one level cottage cluster. So I'm wondering if there's some provision for allowing a larger percentage of lot coverage for something that like a cottage cluster with smaller cottages that are promoting, that have other benefits like promoting community and what have you, and they're what do I want to say? There's small, less density within the lot. Is there any discussion about increasing the maximum amount of coverage for a certain housing type?
I'm glad you brought that up because it allows me to explain an intricacy of the House bill, which the cottage cluster as a housing type is not subject to maximum coverage. And if a city had something like floor area ratio, it would also not be able to be applied. So cottage clusters are exempt. I'm not sure if it's for the reason that you're describing as kind of a built-in incentive for a housing type that does have a lot of affordability benefits and also other benefits like, you know, it's single level housing, it's visitable, it's good for seniors, but it might not be that attractive of a development option. And so I'm not sure if that's the reason the House bill made it that way, but that's the way it works.
And then we also have a chat from Jennifer saying they don't have a sense of what the implications are of increasing above the current standard. If you have any insight on that, Marcy or anyone else, go for it.
Well, you know, maybe what we want to do is take this poll after the next, take it now and then take it after the next presentation, because I understand that it's very abstract and there's some pictures of plans and potential house site layouts that we're going to go through in more detail that will give you a better picture of what does 35% look like on a lot.
Yeah, we can absolutely take it back up again too. And then we also had a chat from Nicole asking if there was interest in increasing the maximum height to 3 stories.
Would that be in exchange for less coverage or just an additional development capacity?
I was just thinking one of the poll options was to increase to from 35%. And so I was wondering where in the Jello mold or where that increase could come. And so I thought we had been polled on height. I might have mistaken that. And if I recall, people didn't really seem to like the idea of going above 2.5 feet or 2.5 stories, but I don't remember this clearly. So I was just wondering, am I totally misremembering that, or where did that land?
I recall that as a result of the public survey, there was some support for if it meant that you could save a tree. People were interested in buildings being able to be taller.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there was, if I could jump in, there seemed to be some support for additional height, but there was a trade-off. There had to be a benefit, you know, for that additional height. And I think one of the examples we were using in the survey was to save a tree, for example. But I don't know that we've nailed down kind of how that might work in the proposed code, but it would be, the height would be an incentive for something else, I think was sort of the general direction, I think.
Okay, I'll end the polling for now, and then we can share the results. And then, yes, we can absolutely take the poll again too after the next slides as well. So, but it looks like we have about 36% supporting an increase above 35%. We have 9% supporting decrease. We have 27 or 3 with staying, and then same percentage needing a little bit more information. So. All right.
Great. Thanks, everybody. So now we're going to talk about this kind of in a different way. Less math and more examples. So I want to plant this question in your head while I go through these examples. if the current standards limit some forms of middle housing, that is like they make some forms of middle housing maybe impossible to build, should they be adjusted or reconsidered? So this is a different way of looking at this. Examples of things that could be adjusted or reconsidered are the side yard height plane or the lot coverage. And I'm going to take 3 of these examples that we've never really been able to talk about in much depth and go through them with some real numbers. And so if we could go to the next slide, these are little 2-scale illustrative plans that we did, taking a sample lot from a real location in Milwaukee, and then looking at if we built certain kind of middle housing on it, what would be the result. And this, I was glad to hear that people were looking at this closely and wondering how much coverage does this actually represent. And so I have some numbers here to share. And this is an example of a triplex. So what we're looking at is the colored building. That's the one that's supposed to be new. All the white buildings around are supposed to be the existing homes. And this is a triplex with 2 units that face the street and 1 unit behind. The 1 unit behind has its own garage. And the total footprint of this actual development is almost 2,000 square feet. It is a 39% coverage where 35% would be allowed today. So one of the questions we want you to consider is like, should something be allowed to go a little bit above if it means that it could be built? Are there any questions about this example? Okay, well, let's go to the second one. So in this one, we had 2 middle housing examples on this, but I'm just going to talk about the one that's labeled B. It's on the right. And we had formerly called this a cottage cluster, but that's incorrect because this is not a cottage cluster. It would not meet the state standards. So we're calling it a quadplex. It's 4 units on a lot. They surround a kind of courtyard that also accommodates parking, or not in the courtyard, but is a kind of shared drive court, paved court area. And together, the footprint of these 4 dwellings, so these are 4 detached dwellings that comprise a quadplex. They're together 3,260 square feet. And that's just where they touch the ground, their footprint. So that means the lot coverage for this example is 33%, where on this size of a lot, 10,000, 30% would be the allowance. So again, you can see it's a little bit more.
So just to be clear on both examples, you're talking about the footprint, and I kind of didn't focus on that with the first one, but because that sounded really small, 1,900 square feet for 3 units, that means 600 square feet per unit, but actually it's 2.5 times 600 square feet per unit, right? So it's could be units of up to.
It could be, yeah.
What is that? My math, 1,500 square feet. Could be 3
I can tell you
1,500 square feet units.
I can tell you what the total square footage of this inside is, because the way that it was designed, it's not each of these houses are 2.5 stories. I think they're actually just 2 stories. And so it's the way that we designed this was resulted in a 3,600 square foot volume. That's how much development is being taken advantage of on this site. And if you recall, this site allows something like 4,750. So it's still only partially taking advantage of that.
I'm sorry, I didn't follow that. It allows that, and with the 35% lot coverage max?
I thought you were asking about the total building capacity, like what's the square footage in total, not just the footprint.
Right.
And I
That's
was,
what I was asking, because I think when you ask people to say, should we give more, allow more lot coverage, it's important that people are understanding that that footprint is not the size of the units. It's only half the size of the units, and maybe in some cases less than half the size of the units. So I just wanted, I mean, so is it, you know, if you're asking, can we give 4 more % of lot coverage, it's sort of like, well, or they can just be slightly smaller units. It's not like they can't do it. It's not
well,
like they can't build anything.
I'm glad you brought this up because it allows me to talk about some of the trade-offs. If you do limit the lot coverage, you do have to build up more. And I think one of the benefits of middle housing is that you might have more units that are level, be able to provide more housing that doesn't require stairs. But if you have very little lot coverage, you are pretty much forced to go up to a second level. If you allowed greater lot coverage, but you might limit the height, then you might actually get, you know, smaller but more one level homes. So those are trade-offs that come with limiting the lot coverage.
I have a hand from Sharon, or hand raised, and then next will be Renee.
I want to be careful because this may be a question that is better suited elsewhere, but it came to mind with kind of the shared courtyard example that you put on the screen, item B, and that is the realities, the practical realities of financing some of these concepts. So for example, I don't know if there's anybody on the committee with lending or financing background, but if shared driveway access would be problematic in any way for financing, or we've talked about splitting large lots with access, shared access, and if that would prohibit the financing. And I know that that's programmatic and probably separate from planning regulations, but at some point, because I've been struggling with this personally, it's how do you make it work? And especially for middle housing, how do you make it affordable or have the financial products that would make it work for real people? And again, I'm perfectly fine if you say, let's defer that question.
Well, I do know a lot about this actually, and involved in the whole House bill discussion for the last year have been the home builders and a lot of builders and financial people who, because everyone kind of sees the crisis that's happening with housing, and a lot of people that you might not expect to be are interested in trying to accommodate more housing in single dwelling zones. And so the financing industry, it will probably they're usually the last to come forward, but the home builders are here. The home builders are ready to build this. They're out down in Salem, in fact, lobbying to make it more possible to do by right land division and to make condominiumization easier and all these things that would make it easier to actually have some of these housing types be home ownership. But the financing industry is going to lag. That is always the case with a new housing product like this. However, some of these are things that, now this one is probably too big, but the triplex might be an example of somebody that could get a home equity line of credit. This is where I think a lot of middle housing might actually be built by people who currently own a home. They can get a home equity line of credit and they could actually build that home if it's, you know, the right size. That is going to limit the size of, you know, a project. But in fact, that's supposed to be, those types of builders are supposed to be an equal partner in this whole venture. So I don't know if that answers your question.
I think it does. It sounds like it's a work in progress, like everything is, as we try and develop this new form of understanding what housing can be.
Renee?
So my question has to do with why are the larger lots now limited to 30% and the smaller lots limited to 35%? In my mind, it should be the opposite, because on a larger lot, you have a setback, and on a smaller lot, you have a setback. So the amount of space you actually have to work with in a larger lot is more. So why is the percentage that's allowed less?
I think it's historic. It's a historic preference for that people who live in these large lot areas deserve to have more land around them. It's in the new world that we're going to, where there are going to be more middle housing options available. The logic that you're describing makes more sense. It's true, but historically, the much more restrictive zoning that would tend to make everything much smaller and further away from its neighbor happened in the outer zoned areas, in the larger lot areas. It is a different philosophy. So we're in the middle of trying to decide, and this is part of what we want to discuss.
So there's no other reason besides just that's the way it is historically?
No, I don't really think there is another reason why.
Okay, just wondered, because it's like reinventing the wheel. I mean, if somebody's already thought about this and they came up with two distinct, percentages,
I mean, I think it was also probably, I mean, it's all speculation now because this is decades old, but I think it was also probably, about limiting the mass, right? Knowing that you've got this 10,000 square foot lot. If you limit the lot coverage, then if you're slightly more restrictive on the lot coverage, you're keeping from having the, sort of the giant thing there, right? So it was a tool for regulating the bulk and the mass of the house to some degree.
well, conversely, I wonder, or if it was, or it could be a way of promoting tree coverage, not just a tree, but something that, I mean, I didn't bring it up because we were running out of time, but it's this idea that 10 single trees, it's not as valuable as 10 trees all together in a little grove. And if you had that component as a consideration when we're talking about lot coverage size, that if larger lots were kept at 30%, but then had some kind of criteria that included more trees.
This is a project for a historian, I think, about why is it that these larger lot areas, it may be for the reason that you say, it may have been to promote farming, urban agriculture. It may have been, as Councillor Beatty says, to limit the overall size because people who wanted to live on large lots wanted to be far away from their neighbor. It could be a copy and pasted zoning code from from a model code of the time. There's just so many things we don't know.
Well, I'm saying we could use it as a tool going forward as something different.
I think if I could just sort of add, if I could just add on to Renee's question, conversely, the smaller lots are allowed to build a bit more, I think probably because they are on a smaller lot and trying to kind of balance out how much structure or how much house, they're allowed to build. Because if it all sort of stayed proportionate, the idea being it's a smaller lot, they can have, so that they can sort of fill up the lot a little bit better and have a slightly larger house to fit their family or something like that. I think it's not unusual to have larger lots have actual less development on them, sort of when you look at the standards. Big lots, big yards, sort of that whole kind of suburban feel, I think. as part of it. It's not unique to us, to our code, certainly. I see that Joseph has his hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to add that again, what applies here historically is the zoning regulations for the zoning district, not for the lot size. So you could have a 10,000 square foot lot in an R5 district, and the R5 standards will apply on that 10,000 square foot lot. The 30%, the reduced lot coverage maximum does not apply in R5. It only applies in R10, no matter what size the lot is. So it's important to know that this is not something that is linked to the specific site in the sense of what are the dimensions of the site. It's where in the city is this site, and what kind of development pattern do we want in this part of the city. And that was the decision that was made, is that these R10 neighborhoods, or these R7 neighborhoods or whatever, would have would be more distant from their site boundaries, and smaller scaled structures relative to the size of the site. Whereas the smaller, the R5 zone and smaller, are intended to be very urban and will have a greater lot coverage because it is a smaller lot, but it's also in a neighborhood that's intended to be more houses closer to the boundaries. So anyway, I think that's a distinction that I haven't heard made yet, is that it's not the site size, it's where it is in the city and what that zoning district is.
That's true historically, and that might come closest to anything that we posited here about why that pattern was set. But I do want to clarify that we're going to a system where there is no zoning boundary, so the coverage and the standards will travel with the lot size to the extent that we keep this in place, which is why we're discussing it. If you have a 10,000 square foot lot in the formerly R5 zone, under the proposal, you would be subject to the old standards of the 10,000 square foot lot. If you're in a 5,000 square, if you do a townhouse lot, I'll take a really extreme example, in the R10 zone, the proposal is that you would be subject to on the perimeter where that townhouse lot meets the formerly R10 zone, you'd be subject to the R10 setbacks and their side yard plane. But internally, so if you had two townhouses, you would internally be able to use the smaller lot standards. So it's a new world, and it's kind of hard to get your head around it. And this idea of there being a transition from dense inner city to lower scaled outer edges, that's not going to be the pattern that we see in the future. Okay, so I'm going to go to the third example, and then we can go to a poll question. All right, so this one, we wanted to ask you what you think about a flag lot situation. This is an actual very deep lot. And today, the lot is like over 12,000 square feet. But we're kind of like pretending that this was a flag lot, or it's made into a flag lot. So on the front, the lot has a house on it. Perhaps we could pretend that's a pre-existing house even that's been turned into quadplex, or it's just remains a single dwelling. But on the back, there's that's actually supposed to be a fourplex. We drew an extra unit in there, but we would take that out. But there would be two units facing each other across a kind of a courtyard. We are able to save a tree in the center of the lot. But these are two separate lots. They would meet two different lot coverages. And I'll go through them. So the front lot has a 1,000 square foot footprint building on it. And the lot area is about 4,200 square feet with that land division. So we are well under the 35% for that lot size at 24% lot coverage. On the rear lot, where we have an 1,800 square foot footprint, and that lot is quite large. So we're, again, well under the 30% lot coverage that applies to that size of a lot. So this one's really more about imagining what might happen in a flag lot situation. Any questions about this? I think we're going to ask some poll questions now.
Marcy, do you want me to do the lot coverage one again?
Yes.
Okay. And then the other one I had on questions was about side yard height plane. I can ask it, but we may not need to.
Right. I think it gets a little too complicated.
Fine, that's good for me. Okay, so you should be seeing the same question that you got a few minutes ago, asking about lot coverage. I think we have almost everyone. Okay, Vera, I'll stop it. Okay, a little different this time. So we have about 60% in support of increasing above 35%, and then we have about 40% at staying at 35%. So that's useful information. And then Councillor Beatty just put in the comments that she'd be open to increase lot coverage for a single story, which is actually what we currently allow for single unit dwellings today in our zone. So if you're a single story, you do get more lot coverage. So that's something that we could definitely consider doing as well.
Yeah, our existing code has up to 10 percentage points increase in lot coverage for single story homes additions. It doesn't cover accessory structures, but additions and that sort of thing. So yeah, do that now.
And I think Dan has his hand raised.
Just a comment, if to the extent that you're considering providing bonuses or greater allowances for certain things, I would encourage you to consider a bonus for at least one accessible unit. And so not just single story, but something that's accessible both, well, ADA compliance, but also allowing aging in place.
Okay.
You're getting some good ideas, Dan, from people.
Sure. Okay, are we moving to the side yard height plane poll question, or are we not doing that?
Nah,
one? No? Okay,
I'm not going to do that.
got it.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we can move to the next steps.
All right. Let's do that. Okay. All right. So I just wanted to so this chart, it may or may not be readable to you, depending on your screen that you're looking at this, but this chart was in your packet. And so this is our sort of our working schedule for next steps for the project going forward now, kind of from this milestone of draft code going to DLCD tomorrow, sort of what's happening between tomorrow and the end of the year. So hopefully it's clear. the purpose of all of this is to sort of just track kind of where we're taking this code through the kind of the work session process. This chart does, it doesn't reflect, but it should, and I will change it, that we have the proposed, the July 14th CPIC meeting where we're going to be talking about townhouse and cottage cluster development types to kind of, again, refine the code and really talk about design standards and that sort of thing. But the goal of all of this kind of moving forward is to continue to workshop the code, refine the code, and include in here multiple opportunities for the public to follow along what's happening, participate. We are planning to accept and ask for written comments throughout the work session process with the Planning Commission. That's not typical. Certainly testimony is something that is accepted and taken in and tracked during the public hearing process. We will be doing that during the work session process as well, and tracking that all in a big, massive spreadsheet of things. We are having NDA meetings right now in June to let folks know kind of where we are in this process, and directing folks to the open house number 3, which will be opening at the end of next week, which is going over the highlights of the proposed code and how folks can participate in the process going forward. So we have kind of identified sections where we will be coming to all of the NDAs to keep them all posted on what's happening. We will be, again, kind of moving from the work session process through the summer with the Planning Commission into public hearing in the fall, and then with the City Council later in the fall. We will be having pilot articles throughout the process to keep folks up to speed on where we are, using the Engage Milwaukee site throughout all of this. I've signed up for, I think, 2, I can do more, sessions at the farmers market to have a table to be sharing information. So we just want to make sure that folks are kind of aware, here's where we've been, here's where we are right now, and here's where we're going, and here are all of the opportunities where folks can continue to participate and comment, review, share ideas, continually as we go through the end of the year to the code adoption process. So that's sort of our proposed kind of schedule of things between now and the end of the year. Are there any questions about the schedule or what's happening at all? I can stop sharing because I don't know if people can read that. But okay. So that's kind of that piece of it. Again, sort of coming next steps more immediately is the July meeting with you folks, and you will be getting the draft code as part of the packets and additional information as we want to talk about townhouse standards and cottage cluster standards. So that's the end of sort of the formal presentations. We wanted to make sure that we had time within the agenda to answer any questions and certainly have open discussion with you folks. If there's anything else that we should be talking about or haven't talked about or what else, let's talk about it now. Councilor Beatty? And you're muted, I'm sorry.
I guess I understood from the last meeting that that what we were going to discuss tonight was sort of feeding into what was going to be on the next round on Engage Milwaukee. So, I mean, is that what's the plan is? The kind of same questions you asked us, or what exactly is going to be on the next round on Engage Milwaukee?
The open house is a basically it's more of an inform kind of process or what we're using it for. So it's presenting to folks, here's what we've been doing all along, here's what we heard from you, here are the key highlights of the proposed code amendments, and here's the process going forward. So we're not asking questions of folks as part of this open house. It's more setting folks up on where we are. Like I said, where we've been, what we heard, where we are right now, here are the high points of the proposed code, and here's how to participate going forward in the adoption process. So people know how they can stay in the loop and ask questions and provide comment and participate going forward. So we aren't asking any specific questions, or we weren't planning to at this point.
We
But-
will leave the comment section open like
Yes.
last time. So then naturally, if there's questions in the comment section that we can answer, we'll be answering those as well. But we won't, there won't be a survey. At least that's not what we've proposed at the moment.
You have a sense, the schedule goes through the end of December. Does that mean code adoption is expected beginning of 2022, or are we dangling out a proposed date there and optimistically?
I'll speak to the optimism on this. Yes, optimistically, our goal was to get into all of the weeds on all the code pieces through the summer with the Planning Commission, have 2 public hearings with the Planning Commission, having spent all of this time in their hearing, have a study session with City Council in November, and then have 2 public hearings with the Planning Commission in December. That was that's the optimistic goal, is that the second meeting in December with City Council would be the adoption party for the code. Again, optimistically. That's why I was saying Christmas. It would be a Christmas present to have the code. But that would be the idea, that by the end of the year, we would have the adopted code. Yeah.
Great.
We'll see. Renee?
Well, since it doesn't seem like there's a lot of other questions, I'm just going to throw out a concern, or a question and a concern. There's this general statement that pops up every once in a while in our packets that says something like, by doing the middle housing, we're ensuring equity. And it's a very vague statement. And I'm just wondering if I could hear a little description about why the zoning changes and code that we're working on, how is that helping equity?
Can I start? I guess I can talk about it in my perspective of being someone who rents. I rent a duplex, and I rent a duplex because I could afford a little bit more space, but I couldn't afford rent for a single family home. So in terms of creating equity, you're providing more options and choices for people that don't currently exist. When I was trying to rent, I did look in Milwaukee, and there were not options that were affordable, or options that I wanted to live in. And so through that, you're automatically creating more equity for people of different incomes, and things like that. So that's one of the main reasons that I see equity playing a part. I also think not everyone wants to live in a single family home, and not everyone can afford to live in a single family home. So automatically you're adjusting some of the equity piece there, because you're creating more options for people that don't, quite frankly, through code, are allowed to exist today. And anyone else can add to that if they want.
I would just add to that that's a really nice example to help make it really clear that those choices would be able to be everywhere. So you should be able to live in a duplex or rent a cottage, and also have access to the beautiful parks and schools and things that tend to be in in some neighborhoods and not in others.
I'll add my perspective too. I have 2 points. One is that middle housing keeps keeps the folks who work in our communities. So people who live in, for example, duplexes or smaller homes or a cottage cluster or an apartment are the teachers and firefighters and nurses and shopkeepers and all those folks who live in our communities, and they don't have to commute into them in order to teach our children, for example. I think that's an equity component. The other one that's often on my mind is the opportunity for people to build wealth is very limited. In the United States, one of the primary ways lower and middle income people build wealth is through their primary home. And if they're lucky enough to own a home or have a starter home, we talk about having a starter home and then buying a bigger home, and this is how we build wealth. These kinds of code changes will allow somebody to, for example, build an ADU in the back. Let's say they're retiring and their Social Security doesn't cover enough. They would be able to, let's say, build an ADU and have a renter, and that income would supplement something like a Social Security, or maybe the college student that moves into the ADU is able to live in a nice place with a yard as well. So those are all versions of equity in my mind that are really important, that don't exist or are very limited right now.
I mean, I think those are all exactly what was kind of thinking behind, the comp plan language, right? The comp plan calls for more middle housing. Even, we were having those discussions even before HB 2001. So, I mean, I think those are all great examples. I do question whether we are undercutting middle housing by introducing the idea of 3,000 square foot lots for individual houses. I do fear that will be the thing we see happen rather than real middle housing. And I do think discussions of that, whether it's in Engage Milwaukee or with the Planning Commission or whatever, need to take on some thorny questions about how, how access that probably means more flag lots, because that's what's going to happen. We're going to have more flag lots because there's a lot of lots are going to be dividable that way as opposed to side to side. The access, the driveways, what that means for parking. I think there's a lot of questions around the 3,000 square foot lots. I'd be very curious to know how many lots in Milwaukee. I mean, when we looked at those maps of 10,000 and 14,000 square feet, I mean, those are maybe good candidates for some kind of dividing, and I kind of like the smaller lots for there. But how many 6,000 square foot lots do we have that can be divided? I think about my neighborhood, which is zoned R5, but I'm pretty sure there are very few, if any, 5,000 square foot lots. They're all 6, 7, 8,000 square foot lots. So think about every lot in the neighborhood being able to be divided in half is kind of a daunting thought. So I think that, to my mind, there's a lot of question about the 3,000 square foot lots and if they're diluting the actual middle housing that we'll get. I mean, I think that's the biggest problem with them, but I think there's a number of other issues around them.
Joseph, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I wanted to just jump in and kind of, I mean, I think it was at the Planning Commission meeting, I brought up the same thing that Councilor Beatty just brought up, and that's, we really want to make sure that we don't create a situation where people or developers or investors are incentivized to create exclusionary neighborhoods by doing land divisions that bring everything down below the threshold where you can have, the middle housing types. And so This is why I think that there's an appetite on the Planning Commission for, not distinguishing, that minimum lot size, to trigger a quadplex or, or to, the right to build a quadplex or a triplex, just if you can do, really truly form-based code. If you can do single or a double, or a triple or a quadplex and put it on a 3,000 square foot lot and make all the other regulations, or comply with all the other regulations and standards, then, more power to you, I think. And that's, kind of the perspective I'm hearing, so that we can avoid creating a situation that might invite an exclusionary neighborhood to be divided at some point. And because that's totally against the spirit of what the comp plan is trying to do. And so, one way that we can do that is to, incentivize the middle housing types, and so, we talked about one way of doing that, which is to allow additional FAR or additional square footage to your footprint or overall structure, if you're doing multiple dwellings instead of a single dwelling. That's a great, it's a great way, I think, of, showing that, actually truly incentivizing creating the housing types that we want to see. But I think that's a challenge that we, need to address head on. And I still feel very strongly that the best way to do that is just to, regulate the form factor and not worry about the number of units that are going into, whatever is being proposed. And so anyway, I'd like to hear us talk about that more, and to consider that more seriously. I know there's challenges, regulatory challenges or whatever, but I feel very strongly about that. I know there's some other members of the Planning Commission do as well. So, and I have other concerns that I'd like to get, kind of address a little bit, but with specifically around land divisions and how are land divisions in these new consolidated residential zones where you can do 3,000 square foot new lots, say, but then we have Goal 5 resources. They abut a creek or a stream or a wetland or some other regulated habitat. How are we going to, how is that going to work? How do those interplay so that we're because if we're increasing the site coverage that's allowed on a smaller lot, and you can go into any residential zone and divide a 0.8 acre site into 3,000 square foot lots, even if it's abutting, it has a creek flowing across it, how does that end up working so that we're protecting that natural resource and protecting the buffers, on those natural resources, and not just saying, well, it's now, look, it's a bunch of 3,000 square foot lots, so they get 50% site coverage, when it was R10 before and they should have only had 30. So that's I'm looking at sites that would apply to here, and just have some questions around how we address that so that we can make sure we're still meeting these broad policy goals, and not undermining ourselves when we come back around and address this later, specifically Goal 5 later.
Sharon, you have your hand up.
Yeah, in terms of the equity question, I think serving on this committee has helped me realize how our land use forms really serve the post-World War II generation and don't serve our current needs at all. And all of us who've just been through the pandemic can appreciate that. I mean, I think of all of the people who were isolated, who were living in senior housing instead of intergenerational housing or cottage clusters, or, just all of the different ways in which we realized we would like to have housing be different because of the isolation many of us suffered. So, yeah, I'm just glad to be able to be on this committee and learn about all the options that will be coming.
Okay, I don't see any members of the public here. It would have been time for Q&A from folks from the public. And it's early. It's only a little after 8, but it's a beautiful evening out. So if there aren't any more questions or comments from the group for tonight, and I don't see any. Still, Renee, sorry, thank you.
I have one last request, and I don't know what's coming up with the Engage Milwaukee, and I talked to Vera a little bit about this. I found the visuals, the illustrations of the, trying to illustrate what potential a potential development would look like when you have the 3 different kind of visuals next to each other. Visually, they didn't look like anything close to 35% coverage to me. And having 3 different kind of drawings without a lot of explanation left me puzzling as to what was trying to be illustrated. And I sit in on these meetings, so if I don't understand it, there's got to be others that are going to wonder as well. And even looking at it tonight with all the numbers next to it, the black and white sketches that show the overview, they don't convey to me that this is a lot with a 35% coverage. And so I would ask that if we're going to put visuals out to the public or the report, or even for us, that they have that they're a little easier to read as far as what the actual communication is supposed to be.
Okay. We will do that. We will we've been looking at sort of what the text and so on will be for the open house, but we can be working through with the visuals and make sure that we're communicating better with the illustrations. So we can do that. Okay. Thank you for that. Okay. So I guess I will entertain a motion to adjourn this meeting. Wish everyone a great evening. Stay cool on Monday. If it's actually going to be 100 degrees. It's terrible. But enjoy the weekend. Hopefully we can see most, if not all of you. I think there are a couple folks that did have a conflict on the July 14th date when I sent out the doodle poll. We did the best we could to kind of get as many people as we could. So apologies if you couldn't make it. We will record the meeting, and I'm happy to meet individually with folks if you can't make it on that particular night. So I'm happy to do that as well. But there's nothing, and again, my door is always open. The building is actually open to the public, so the door is literally open. So if folks want to come in to the offices and have a conversation, I'm happy to do that too. So thanks everyone. This was a great conversation. I really appreciate your feedback. Have a great weekend, and hopefully we will see you in a few weeks. But
Thank you
very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Good night, everybody. Thank you.